Because I know we have a panel that starts immediately after this one, I'm going to dive right in. People are still free to wander in as they finish getting coffee, but I'd like to introduce a very wonderful panel that I get to moderate today. My name's Callie Schrader. I work for the Electronic Privacy Information Center based in DC. I'm the Global Privacy Counsel there, and this panel will be discussing the limits of emergency powers and how to protect privacy in exceptional circumstances, similar to what we have all lived through for the past several years. With me is a truly phenomenal panel. We have Malavika Jayaram, who is the Executive Director of Digital Asia Hub and the Faculty Associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. She's also faculty at Yongpeng Hao School of Law in Singapore. Christina Irion, who is Associate Professor at the Institute for Information Law at University of Amsterdam and also directs a summer course on privacy law and policy there. We have Patrick Penning, Head of Information Society Department at the Council of Europe. And joining us virtually, we have Rafael Zanetta, the Executive Director of Data Privacy Brazil's Research Association. Just as a quick introduction to what we're discussing here today, many regulations have emergency exceptions when there is a state of emergency. So laws that are in place, rights that are in place may be temporarily suspended or tweaked during in order to address an emergency situation. As some examples of that, there was a BBC article from early 2021 that mentioned 32 countries had used the military to enforce different COVID lockdown rules. 22 had used surveillance drones, 28 implemented internet censorship of some kind, 13 had internet shutdowns, at least 120 contact tracing applications were put in use across 71 countries, and there was mass expansion of both facial recognition and cell phone location tracking during these circumstances. Many of these were the results of the emergency power exceptions during the state of emergency that was declared during COVID. According to the CoronaNet database, 124 countries had declared a state of emergency in 2020 that was specifically tied to COVID. And this panel addresses not only how that works in function, how that works in the structure of law, but also when there are limits to, and when there should be limits to how long emergency powers can last, and how we can either build that into law, address that through societal pushback, address that through agencies, and look at the risks of allowing emergency circumstances to continue indefinitely. Some of those risks are normalizing different exceptions to privacy that then lead to those privacy rights essentially being fully suspended or people not expecting to be able to exercise those rights anymore. So I don't want to talk too much longer. We have way too many excellent speakers. I would like to turn first to each of our speakers to speak for about 5 minutes about their role, what their work has been, and how their work ties directly into this topic, just so we can set the scene a little bit. Can we turn first to Rafael?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Kelly?
I can hear you. Can everyone hear okay?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. It's a true pleasure to be here. And I think the topic is extremely important considering the major transformations that we are facing in Brazil. And one thing that I would like to start as a starting point for this discussion is that in the beginning of the pandemic, we were truly concerned about this major trend of expanding surveillance and the threats towards the victories that we had in Brazil in 2018 with the enactment of the data protection law and the whole movement of civil society of expanding the grammar of fundamental rights and digital rights. Even some philosophers like George Agamben and others published very worrying philosophical essays about the expansion of surveillance. But indeed, what we had in Brazil was something very unique, I would say. We had a counter movement, which was very powerful in the defense of data protection and the data protection guarantees. And there was a unique case that happened in the Supreme Court in which the federal government of Jair Bolsonaro, they wanted to do research on the impact of pandemic. So they were relying on one specific legislation that would allow the government in emergency times to collect data from telecommunication operators and so they could conduct this research. And there was a huge clash that was pushed by the Brazilian Bar Association and many NGOs that took the discussion to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court recognized that data protection was an autonomous and fundamental right. And it would not allow emergency measures or actions by the government to overcome the protections guaranteed by the legislation. So this was a unique turning point. In the very beginning of the pandemic, it happened actually in May, and we published an essay at the European Data Protection Reveal. Bruno Bioni, who is attending the conference here in presence with you, a co-author of this paper, we could show that this was a very unique opportunity in which the Supreme Court recognized this fundamental and autonomous character of data protection law and somehow blocked any further attempts from the Brazilian government to impose emergency measures during the pandemic that would threaten those rights. We also saw similar counter movements happened in other Latin American countries. In Colombia, for instance, our partners from Fundación Carisma, they fought a very important fight against a contact tracing app by the government of Colombia, also trying to push back those emergency measures to impose contact tracing. Also, this happened in Argentina. So I would say that this was also a unique opportunity for Latin American activists and the whole community of data protection enforcers to give a clear message to the government that it was not like something that they could freely do based on emergency laws or specific legislations that would expand the powers of those governments. So it was also counterintuitive because we would imagine in the beginning of the pandemic that it was a game that we would always lose. But in fact, was not something like that. There was some really important victories and also an understanding from the government that by pushing and by advancing principles of data protection and advancing clear balancing and visualizing the kinds of threats and risks for fundamental rights, it would legitimate their actions. We could also see that in the state level in São Paulo, in which we had hundreds of public actions against the government of São Paulo when it was in trying to impose measures of contact tracing and using data from telecommunication operators as well, especially radio information, to understand the movement of citizens. So I would say that it's important as well to use these lenses of the counter movements that are happening in those countries to enrich the discussion about this dynamic scenario in which it's not only about threats and the expansion of powers of governments, there is also a very profound movement of civil society organizations and scholars and the community of data protection, which is expanding in those countries and trying to push back and to balance the situation.
Perfect. That's a really wonderful overview of how this has affected Brazil, both in attempts to engage emergency powers in oppressive ways and also in the pushback and the success of that pushback. Malavika, I'd like to turn to you and just ask what you've seen on the ground when it comes to emergency exceptions and whether there are any general takeaways or any connections to what Rafael mentioned as well.
Yeah, thank you for putting this together. I'm particularly happy that you're not leaving Brazil and Asia to the end of the panel, which is usually where the rest of the world, after Europe and US, have had their say. So, and I think it's actually very meaningful for a very specific reason. It's one area where Asia was actually ahead of the curve, both in terms of starting the pandemic, but also in terms of the responses to it. So I think it actually does make sense chronologically as well, that we sort of elevate Asia a little bit. So I think my entry point to this conversation is someone who actually lived through this in Asia. I was in Hong Kong. I moved to Singapore during the pandemic or just before. And I originally come from India, so I've sort of seen 3 countries' experiences very closely on the ground, which I think straddles this sort of spectrum from precarity to privilege. And one of my very close friends and great collaborators, Nishant Shah, had this amazing footer on his email, which I've always loved. It said, "Your lack of planning does not constitute my emergency." He used it to tell students, if you want a reference, ask me 6 weeks before you need it, not the night before, right? That was sort of the context in which he used it. But I think it's really relevant for this discussion because if one thing Asia had, it was preparedness. We'd had SARS in 2003, we'd had swine flu in 2009. So for me, seeing people wearing masks was a health issue. It wasn't a politicized, partisan thing. And it was also not a selfish thing, right? So you walk around Hong Kong, which is incredibly dense, right? People are living in tiny, tiny tenement-like housing in really high skyscrapers. They have an amazing public transport system. Even in peacetime or non-COVID time, you see people wearing masks. And visitors to Hong Kong always assume it's because people are very paranoid and germ-phobic about getting disease. Once they stick around, they realize it's actually very other regarding because it's people who have a cough or hay fever, allergies, who don't want to give it to other people. So it's actually a very altruistic other regarding, I want to keep my job and go to work and not get, not have my pay docked on one hand, but also saying, if I'm going to be in close proximity with people, I want to be sensitive to not actually spread disease. So it's something, people have the slightest sniffle, they wear a mask. So you see this in a lot of Asia, right? So for us, when the pandemic hit, it was like, okay, business as usual, we'll pull out the masks and life will go on, right? The other thing that happened because of this prior experience is countries like Singapore had actually created emergency preparedness systems, right? So Singapore had a traffic light system, other countries had traffic light systems that literally got switched on overnight. Right? The pandemic hit, other countries were sort of struggling, saying, we'll wait for the WHO to say something, we'll wait for somebody else to give us guidance from on high. Singapore was like, we have a system, we're just going to switch it on. And as an academic and educator, I went from in-person classes to online practically overnight without needing extra training because we'd already had compulsory emergency preparedness training. So while everyone else was taking to Twitter in the US saying, what are you using? Are you using Zoom? Are you using Airtable? What are you doing? Is, videos on or off for students? What are your privacy policies? We were already teaching classes, which isn't to ignore the enormous trauma that switch involved, both for faculty and students, and that's a whole other topic, and the surveillance of education tools and technology. But I think it's just a way of showing you that the preparedness was something that Asia was very, very ahead of the curve on. I think also what was interesting is that Raphael mentioned the grammar, right, of civil society and the language used to describe this. It's really interesting to see the language used across Asia. Singapore would call it a circuit breaker. We've just got a little circuit breaker. It's not a lockdown, don't panic. It's definitely not an emergency. It's just this tiny little circuit breaker to give us a breather so that we give us a chance to sort of get ahead of the disease, right? So there was this kind of language of preventing panic. That's the sort of good side of it. But I think the sort of flip side of this unwillingness to create hysteria and panic is that it gave a lot of more authoritarian governments in the region, people with more militarized governments, Thailand, the Philippines with its war against drugs, Malaysia, Cambodia, a lot of these other countries actually took to this as a way of saying, in order to prevent hysteria and panic, we're actually going to use every single emergency power available to us, and some that are not, to actually control crowds, to shut down journalism, to shut down free speech. The homeless were arrested. Somebody who walked through, an artist who walked through Bangkok airport was actually arrested under the Computer Crimes Act, which is also a way of showing you that it's not just one emergency legislation, it's a whole infrastructure and assemblage of emergency powers. He was arrested under the Computer Crimes Act for saying that nobody screened me when I arrived from Barcelona. There's no infrastructure at the airport to control COVID. So he was arrested for saying something that was allegedly, seen as anti-government. protests were stopped. And in Hong Kong, we had this really weird sort of Schrodinger's mask moment, where until then, activists were prevented from wearing masks because they weren't allowed to be anonymous. They wanted to track who was in the protests against the sort of political situation in Hong Kong, the handover to China. There was Occupy Hong Kong. There were all these reasons why masks were very integral to preserving anonymity and privacy. And then you had this shift where you were telling everybody to wear masks for health reasons. So activists were going, okay, wait, am I wearing a mask for health, or am I not wearing a mask so you can surveil me? Like, which one is it? Right? So you had these sort of weird things going on. And I'm just sort of using this to sort of set the stage of what we sort of lived through. And I'll just stop there now, and we can talk about some of the more specific powers that were used and abused later.
I'm, by the way, when I'm typing, it's because I'm taking notes on more questions I want to ask to follow up. I'm absolutely going to come back to those emergency circumstances and abuses of powers. But first, I would like to turn very quickly to Christina to see what the circumstances were in Europe, what the experience was, and some of the possibly abuses or just uses of emergency powers that you saw on the ground here.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. Also, from my side, I think we are all a bit tired with COVID and Corona, and that's why I'm so grateful to the audience that you make the effort to come here to this panel, because I believe it has a lot of important lessons we can learn, not just for the next pandemic, but for the entire digital transformation of our societies, education, work, and so on. So I really went through all the emergency powers in Europe. I'm covering a bit the EU so that we are not grazing on the same meadow with Patrick from the Council of Europe, and I looked it up, and first of all, the EU itself has no emergency powers. Yeah, that is really the prerogative of the EU member states, and then we have seen again that the European Union is united in diversity. Every country has its own constitutional instruments and ways of dealing with such an emergency situation like the pandemic. And we were certainly not as good as prepared. I would say, of course, every country has some sort of a plan and has safeguards and measures for an epidemic when it breaks out. But I think nobody was really prepared for that. What happened was that most member states' constitutional mechanisms allow for the recourse to emergency or the state of emergency, and that was also the avenue that many of the member states have taken. So I made a list. So it's Malta, Czechia, Estonia, Finland, France, Hungary, Latvia, Luxembourg, Malta again, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, and Spain. They all used emergency powers in order to come up quickly with measures, legislative measures to address the pandemic. However, even where the other countries where they could have done so, they resorted to normal legislative measures. For example, Germany, for historic reason, doesn't like to quickly flex the emergency powers from the constitution. But also Austria, Cyprus, Poland, and Slovenia did not use these constitutional emergency powers. So those legislations that have been adopted in situation of emergency, they often raise questions as to their temporal limits, to safeguards, to fundamental rights, proportionality, and legal certainty. They are mostly made without the direct approval of the parliament of the country. They give executive power, and sometimes governments are allowed to rule by decree. And that, of course, involves certain risks. At the same time, also the health situation was constantly evolving, so what was proportionate maybe at one point, a few months later wasn't anymore. So you have to move kind of dynamically with the situation of the pandemic. I cannot cover all the countries in the European Union, but I selected Hungary because that was a very much criticized way of handling and executing emergency powers. In fact, that was done quite early by the Hungarian government, and the criticism relates mostly to the broad powers that it grants to the government without a time limit attached in the first instance, and that Hungary actually chose to suspend suspend several articles of the General Data Protection Regulation, which has been criticized widely outside of Hungary by, of course, the European Commission and the European Data Protection Board and other institutions. Now, when we look at the GDPR, in fact, you could say that public health is really deeply ingrained in the fabric of the GDPR. If you just make a word count of public health, you will find it 12 times throughout the GDPR, only in the text, not in the recitals. And the point is that this is one of these acknowledged public interest grounds that allow certain interventions with the fundamental right to privacy. And therefore it was actually, or you could say it is possible to deal with most of the challenges unless time is the biggest problem. When you really have to move very fast and there's often not enough time to really do a thorough data protection impact assessment or to really start from the scratch with privacy by design, that is then often latched on a bit later once you have a bit more time again. However, the GDPR was in the European Union by many governments and stakeholders singled out as the problem. Yeah, it hinders proper countermeasures to deal with the pandemic. It is too difficult. It is ways too bureaucratic, formalistic, and so on. You know probably all this. But what I mean to say is that I think what went well is that the responsible EU institutions, especially the European Data Protection Board and also the Commission, they came out quite quickly with guidance and instruments that should help the effort. The Commission started a bit late, but it helped very much to coordinate especially the contact tracing apps between the member states and helping also to subtly, because they cannot make these decisions, but subtly push in the right direction what is about the design and the technical architecture that would be better, more data protection proof. So this is a good thing. We have seen, of course, contact tracing app as the main issue, but also the use, like Raphael said earlier, of telecommunications data in the beginning a bit too unconcerned, but quickly this moved into the right direction to use only aggregated and anonymized telecommunications data. And very limited, we have also had drone surveillance, but I tried to find out where that really happened. So in Malaga, in Sicily, some mayor had a few drones up, and Messina was talking himself on the speaker, urging people to go back home. So all in all, we have had many lessons learned about how quickly we are able to develop this type of apps and technical solutions. Also in how far they really have been effective is very disputed still with research going on, whether these contact tracing app really have helped to reduce infection and to make people alert and give the warnings, because you need a number of people to also contribute to it to make that first become really workable. We have seen great academic engagement, so many of colleagues from our institute, but also from many other institutions in Europe, have tried to really assist with their know-how, how we get a proper privacy-preserving mobile phone, Corona, and such an app. And that again has helped to bring a better technology into the member states. Last but not least, there has been a huge survey also done by colleagues of my institute. I wasn't directly involved. Now in the aftermath, what this has all done to society, public trust, and what we can improve. So maybe in the discussion a bit later, I can give you some of these takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I would also like to hear from Patrick on what the perspective is from the Council of Europe and to some extent whether you've seen legal abuses within that system or whether you think that there may be some proposals for change in the future.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming as well. Even if you're sitting in the back of the room and try to escape at early times, I think it's also the level of energy after 3 days, obviously, that goes down a little bit. Now, I'll try to focus on the subject. That is, First of all, the crisis situations, am I speaking too closely to the microphone maybe? Crisis situations are not very conducive to individual rights and protection of human rights. Let's face it. Exceptional circumstances, especially when a crisis situation involves a moving target, where the government itself is not very clear where it wants to go. I understand that Hong Kong and Singapore may have been well prepared. Europe was definitely not well prepared, and was trying to ensure that this moving target of the crisis, there was a bit of a panicky reaction in many of the governments that tried to impose a number of things in different countries. In many countries with emergency situations, they requested exceptions to the application of the European Convention on Human Rights. Quite a number of the countries did so, on quite a number of the articles, including on freedom of expression related issues, not only on privacy related issues, but also on other articles of the European Convention of Human Rights. And I would even say that some of the countries that did not ask for those exceptions were maybe in some cases taking measures that were going beyond what those that requested those exceptions were taking. So crisis situations, and I see that this program has been written before the current war situation, because the war situation is even a crisis situation that goes beyond what we have experienced during the COVID crisis. Maybe not so much worldwide, but certainly in the localities where this is taking place, has further far-reaching impacts. It's a time for experimenting with new technologies. It's a time for increased control. It is a time where these experimentations, and I'm thinking of, for example, the health apps that we've been speaking about now, but also facial recognition, where it's implicit in some of the things that you're saying, the expansion of facial recognition in order to control movement, etc., has become quite to the foreground. And we see that now in the war situation in Ukraine, where facial recognition and the exploitation of facial recognition becomes an element of control. So the Council of Europe, in its Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, of course, has strict conditions when exceptions are being made. And they have to, of course, comply with the rule of law, they have to comply with a democratic society, they have to be time limited, etc., etc. We can come back to those conditions afterwards, if you like. I think it's important that, given the number of exceptions to the application of the European Convention of Human Rights, and I'm now speaking last after our other continents have been able to express themselves, for the European Convention of Human Rights, the number of countries that requested exceptional measures was enormous, to that extent that our Secretary General of the Council of Europe had to say, we'll provide you with a toolkit on respecting democracy, rule of law, and human rights in the framework of the COVID-19 sanitary crisis. So it was felt necessary from the side of the Council of Europe, trying to defend those human rights and individual freedoms, to make a statement on what can you do and what should you not be doing. In the first place, oriented to those countries that asked for exceptional measures, but also to those that applied those exceptional measures without asking for it. It also, specifically in the data protection field, we had two joint statements immediately after the coming of the crisis. One was the right to data protection in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, and the second was on digital contact tracing, when the whole debate started about how far should we go with this digital contact tracing. what should be the limitations, how should it be organized, which type of applications should be used and should not be used, what are the limits in terms of keeping content locally, etc., etc. So these issues. Now, also our modernized Convention 108 stipulates the context in which exceptions, and then we can go afterwards in the debate maybe also onto what are these conditions basically. But exceptions are only possible if they are prescribed by law, if they respect human rights, if they are necessity, if there's a necessity in a democratic society, if they are proportionate, if they are time limited. And we had to assess, and that's why we made a report for the concerning the 55 countries which are a party to the Convention 108, to look into what has been the practice in those countries. And I can give you the references so you can read the conclusions about it. During the debate, we can go into what are the conditions that we want to foresee when those exceptional circumstances take place. Thank you.
So just for a little preface, I very actively encourage audience questions during panels. I'll give you a chance to think about it for a second and steal the first question for myself. But if at any time you do have questions, once the panelists respond, I will check to see each time, and please feel free to raise your hand, and we'd like to hear from you as well. For a first question, I'm consolidating something that I've heard several of you address in your statements, and that is that emergency circumstances and powers frequently have the problem where they expand beyond what may be deemed reasonable. Malavika raised several specific examples of clear abuses of free speech and of individual rights that went beyond just addressing a health crisis. And this isn't necessarily unique to COVID. This is also a serious risk when there's emergency situations that deal with natural disasters or deal with conflicts, with wars. And finding the balance between how you address conflicts but make sure that emergency measures go no further is clearly a very complicated matter. My question is, how and when do we hold governments accountable on whether their measures are actually addressing the declared emergency and whether they are proportionate, particularly in cases where they were not necessarily prepared for the crisis and so are testing measures for efficacy at the outset? I'm going to start with Malavika just because you raised the specific examples, but I will turn to each of the panelists as well.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is you take pandemic plus populism plus exception and you have a permagency, right? It's sort of this, it's not a moment, it's not a specific end when you can sort of say this is when it shifts and we go back to whatever normal means. But there are incentives, just like with patent protection, to evergreen something. You want to evergreen these emergency powers, so you keep the threat models always high. It's panic porn every day, and it's just this way of sort of establishing, this incumbent desire to stamp out all kinds of dissent. And I think one of the really dangerous things here is that a lot of countries don't see the disease as COVID as the actual disease or the contingent to be stamped out. It's freedom and liberties and rights that are the real disease. They don't want that to be contagious in a population, right? So emergency powers are often evergreened to achieve these other sort of secondary uses and not actually tackling the public health issue. And I think one very concrete way that countries have tried to limit this and mitigate it is through some kind of sunset clause where they say this will expire in 2 years unless it's renewed. A lot of the countries I mentioned have tried to do that. But one of the problems, I think there's a lot of empirical work that's emerging now, and there's this really great piece by Marina Motsevec where she talks about how when you look at these actual statutes and these powers, it is a slippery slope, exactly as you're indicating. But what happens is that they did experiments and they found that if something is done and presented as a compromise or a trade-off in a moment of crisis, and a second condition is if it's seen as something that has been approved by someone else, right? Then you can switch off your brain and say, it's already been approved. I don't need to exercise judgment. I can approve it again. These are the two situations in which you tend to sort of keep extending these powers, and there is no sort of actual end in sight. And I'll just end by saying one thing, which is that there's another great paper by the Center for AI and Data Governance in Singapore, at Singapore Management University. Two reasons they gave why governments might actually walk back some of these emergency measures. One is to actually hold on to and retain public trust, because this is not the only pandemic. There will be others. And they want to show through dismantling Trace Together and Safe Entry and all these other apps that they created, everyone was surprised that they shut them off as quickly as they did. People thought that they would be expanded into all kinds of other uses, but they actually said, we're just dismantling this apparatus, we don't need it anymore, which is very surprising. But I think the reason they're doing it is they want to ensure that the next time there's a pandemic, the next time there's a war, there's some other kind of humanitarian crisis or disaster, people will look back on this and say, oh, they were actually using it in a necessary and proportionate way. We can trust them to do it again, right? So there is an incentive to actually walk something back when, all the principles of data minimization, deletion, blah, blah, when all of those are met. It is actually a good reason to do that. And the second reason that they give is to show best practices, right? We have to think in terms of governments competing in this space, right? In a very market-driven economy, but also in the reputation economy, they want to show that they have best practices, as a place that people can trust, but also that other people can learn from. So they're also in the sort of soft power game, right? China might send PPE and vaccines to a lot of countries as sort of vaccine diplomacy, but also this kind of trading in norms and practices and the privacy rules around particular passports and apps is also a way of sort of exporting that soft power. And I think that's very critical in a region where everyone else is seen as a bit of a banana republic, where they're doing really crazy things with the data and with the emergency powers. The few countries that are trying to actually be reasonable are seen as the ones that might come out on top.
Interesting. I will allow both of you to take a moment to respond as well, but Raphael, I was thinking of how this ties into what you mentioned about public pushback and how that led to changes in protecting rights in Brazil. Do you think that that is something that can be depended on in this situation, or is it something where when you're trying to find the limits of what emergency measures actually apply in an emergency situation, is that a method that you think can actually stand up to all of the possible abuses?
Yeah, and let me just start by agreeing with Malavika and what she said about the perception of some governments that COVID is not the viral, it's not the problem to be tackled, but actually liberties and social movements. I would say, as you all know, Brazil is facing a very strange political scenario of authoritarian government of Jair Bolsonaro, which completely dismissed COVID. Actually, he said it was just a small flu. He didn't do anything at the federal level to tackle COVID at all. Actually, he was against any kind of measures by state level governors. At the same time, there is this ambiguity in which Jair Bolsonaro also identifies social movements as emerging threats and is trying to pass a new counter-terrorist law, which is clearly inspired by the Patriot Act of the United States of America. So in Brazil, we still live in the shadow of the Patriot Act, and the experience of the Patriot Act as being an example of the expansion of the executive power to do emergency policies, but actually for the military and for Bolsonaro, they say that the enemies are living inside the country. Sometimes they say they are like NGOs funded by George Soros. They say that it's environmental activists which are trying to take down the government. They say many things, and they're trying to advance this counter-terrorist law trying to expand the role of the executive power. I think the counter movement being done in Brazil, it's about very essential issues of rule of law and democratic society and legality and counterbalancing powers of the executive. So trying to make it impossible for the executive power to have this massive intelligence structure and to identify threats and to identify the use of police actions and so on only by the executive. So there's this constant move to try to set up new responsibilities and roles for the Congress as well, for external authorities. And that's why we're fighting so hard in Brazil to have an independent data protection authority, which can be also a point of power, so to speak, to counterbalance that as well. And as you know, I think Brazil is a very unique democracy and the data protection legal regime. In fact, our data protection authority is composed by 3 former members of the armed forces. I think that's unique in a democracy and something very strange as well. So we're trying to expand the civilian role of the data protection authority and to make sure it can really care about rights of citizens and not like national security interests. But there's this tremendous confusion going on in Brazil.
Excellent. To turn from that, I want to give both Christina and Patrick a chance to respond, and I also saw that there's already at least one audience question. So any thoughts before we turn to the audience?
Very briefly, I would argue that in the European Union, in the very beginning, data protection was perceived as an obstacle, something that makes it harder to actually come up with, these magic technological solutions that are going to help contain the pandemic. But this has, I think, also changed halfway through. I believe that thanks also to the work of data protection authorities and EU institutions, that there was slowly also the recognition that that the public will not install these apps, that the public will not support these or that measures if they are forced on them. So that it has to be voluntary, that a good privacy by design approach will be necessary in order to bring people on board. And after a while, what was first a curse turned into a virtue. Yeah, that was like a recognition process that took a moment of time. In addition, there was this difficult argument that was raised that it is not possible to do research in the causes and the problems with the COVID-19 pandemic, because it's not possible to transfer health data between EU countries and other parts of the world. Also, this was quite quickly refuted, that this is actually, there are ways to do research together, and that even in the GDPR there is a specific exception for emergency and health, public health emergencies to make that possible. So all these kind of arguments have after a while also lost again their power. What strikes me is also from this research that I mentioned earlier from our institute, is that while most of the discourse has centered on privacy issues, there are much broader concerns, of course, to consider. I believe that compared to what Malavika and Raphael say, it's maybe a little bit a smaller scale, but yet also this report for EU has flagged that there are matters of function creep with this personal data that is collected in the fight against the pandemic, that it normalizes new forms of social control and surveillance. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are getting used to constantly check in and check out with our app everywhere. That we have issues with public transparency and trust here. There has been a criticism that public governments in the EU have surrendered part of the state authority to private companies, that helped to make these apps and other technologies work. that there is a lack of accountability and public control later in the process that should always be ensured. And of course, it was mentioned earlier also by Patrick, we really need for everything of this a good legal basis. It's not possible that we are just go and do things, right, just because. But the legal basis needs to create the necessary powers, but also sets the limitations very clearly, and has to make sure that we as data subjects, we can turn to the authority or to the court in order to get our rights.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, anything to add before?
Yes, thank you. You asked about the efficiency and effectiveness of measures, and to which extent they would influence basically what is to be done with those measures afterwards. And I would say that in many cases, the confrontation with such a deep crisis basically put a number of governments in a panic mode and try to maneuver between what is really needed and what is possible, and sometimes giving argumentation on what is needed in view of what was possible, which did, of course, not necessarily lead to trust. So for many of the measures, the effective results of the measures was not sufficient distance. And they should have had a certain distance with the possibility to withdraw the measures where there's no concrete evidence of the benefits, but maybe concrete evidence of the side effects, of the impact on human rights impact, on the individual rights impact. So this is something that we need to take into account. That's why we always argued for the need for a time limit applied to the retention period of all collected personal data and legal sunset clauses. I think that's important. Also, a legally guaranteed purpose limitation. What are we going to use it for? The purpose of any processing must be precisely defined and based on a specific legal basis, I repeat it again, with the exclusion of further processing for any other purpose. Yeah. The proportionality of the measures. What are we trying to combat, and what are we employing, which tools are we employing in order to do that? Are we trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer? You know, these are the kind of things that we need to be able to respond to. Also, the transparency and the explainability of the data processing. I think that's important also to build the trust. And I'm glad to see that in Asia, again, a number of the measures were withdrawn at an early stage. I don't know of many. Some of course, the emergency state of emergency in many of the countries has been lifted, and also their exceptions to the European Convention of Human Rights have been lifted. But in many cases, the COVID apps are still applicable in quite a number of countries. And you cannot necessarily cross borders without having your COVID applications on you. I heard that in the United States, but there's no one from, you are here, that this is a carton that doesn't fit into your wallet. Well, for us in Europe, in many countries, this fits into our mobile phone, and you have to show your white hand in order to be able to pass the controls, even sometimes to go to restaurants or fly or whatever, doing that. You know? And also accountability of data controllers. I think that's also important. That I hope that with this whole crisis, however, there's been a greater awareness and a greater compliance with those requirements that that should contribute to an increase of trust of the citizens. But I'm not so sure that this is really happening.
That's fair. All right, I saw one question over here. If it's possible to get a mic over. Thank you. Also, while we're getting the mic over, I just want to note, as the only American on the stage, the U.S. is not exempt. The president in the U.S. may access up to 136 statutory emergency powers in states of national emergency, and we have had various ongoing declared national emergencies for several decades. So that's how that's been. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for all of this incredible, interesting information and specific cases. I was interested by what Rafael mentioned in terms of the DPAs, and I was wondering how this puts in question the integrity of our DPAs, because there's in many countries where DPAs did require information and never got it, or simply did not require any information, even though there were clearly rights that were being violated. So this is often an issue that comes up, are they truly independent? It's different from country to country, but I'm just curious how this puts in question really the integrity of these authorities.
Anyone want to take a first stab?
It's a statement. So it's, I think, definitely what I mentioned before is the whole issue of trust. And that is, to which extent are the measures that are being put forward based on whatever assumptions that are being made are done on a legal basis, and to which extent the crisis situation and emergency situation allows or makes decision makers feel that they are allowed to bypass a number of regulations in view of the emergency, so to say. It does not build trust. It does not build trust. And we've seen that, for example, I live in France. The first applications that were rendered public had very little adherence from the side of the public. So they had to completely change over the applications and the launch of those applications with the larger public, because there's no trust.
If anyone else wants to take an answer to that question, please feel free. But also, if you have any other questions, please raise your hand and I'll make sure the mic gets over to you. And if no one else does, I have a list. Oh, we've got more. Sorry.
Hello everyone, Bruno Bioni from DataPress Brazil, colleague of Rafael Zanata. My question is with regards what Professor Christine has mentioned, I read, about techno-solutionism. So I think we had also a really good counter movements as well, but I think the emergency period left room to advance this narrative and the grammar about techno-solutionism. For instance, in Brazil, we could see some municipalities or local governments acquiring facial recognition technologies to monitor social movement, but without providing, for instance, masks. So my question is, what kind of learnings we can have from this specific emergency period to advance the discussion about sphere transgression and how we are seeing this intersection between data infrastructure and power to advance public policies and are even rethinking what is welfare state in a data-driven economy or society.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you. I think I can underline what Patrick already said, is that the first generation of these, especially these contact tracing apps, they were crap. Basically, all member states very quickly started developing something. Everybody had their own design and digital architecture and solutions. Half roughly immediately embarked on centralized governance of the data instead of using decentralized and therefore the least privacy invasive solutions. Some even used private sector companies to make an app for that, right? And we have seen that that led to a pushback, and where also the data protection authorities were actually very relevant, and that we very quickly managed to streamline what is the best approach. And that was done with a unique, I would say, coalition of recommendations and guidance, where the European Commission, who is not in charge of doing this type of like a harmonization of health policies, but came out with guidelines where the European Data Protection Board adopted guidelines, where the Council of Europe adopted guidelines, where the OECD and also the OSZE, and they converged on really a lot of points, thereby creating what we would say a best practice approach. And this best practice approach is now used almost all over, and it involves that it should be voluntary, not forced. But of course, the discussion then is how voluntary is it if you have to, for example, use this app in order to check in for a restaurant. Yeah, but these discussions you will have. You have the decentralized architecture. You have that all the data should be on the phone. That you use only temporary identification codes that are then cannot be traced back, so that everything is much more secure. So this, I would say, has been in the having some time to develop this. We have now a reasonably good standard for that. And yet, it is probably not good enough because according to the research, when you need 60% of the population using this app actively in order to have any effect of it on the pandemic spread. So in the end, maybe this whole app did not show its efficiency. I think we can draw important lessons from that, not just for the next pandemic, I hope that won't happen, but actually for a lot of infrastructures and technologies that we have embraced during the pandemic, eagerly, yeah, for our distant working, for under university distant teaching, even these exams, yeah, that the students have to take online with under surveillance, for the schools, for collaboration with colleagues and video conferencing tools. All of this stuff, in a way, is should be a bit similar than like the COVID tracing apps. It should basically be built around the principle of privacy. It should not piggyback on metadata that we are generating. We should have safe spaces, and especially when it's public institutions and public infrastructures, we should not resort then to private infrastructures to do what used to be public. Yeah, we have to be able to keep that also a public infrastructure that is safe and trustworthy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I saw that Patrick also has a comment, and then Malavika, and Raphael, you can also comment as well if you would like, even though it's a little bit cheating because that's your colleague.
That's true.
He asked the question, so that would be easy for him to answer.
It was
anyway,
a plant.
To come back to what Christina said also about what are the consequences of the use of technology right now, and I think it is important that I would reverse the title of the panel a little bit. That is, to which extent would we be able to use those exceptional circumstances and the devices and the practices that have been developed to respond to those exceptional circumstances in a positive way. So to turn things around, because, and there are many things that I think we can learn. It's always a little bit of a boost of technological development, a boost of practices in those crisis situations, because we say we will not do things again as we used to be doing them. And let's also look at what are the positive things that we can draw from there. And there are positive things about that as well. That doesn't mean that we should go into the direction of the technological solutionism, as you called it. I work at the interplay of data protection, cybercrime, because we also have the Cybercrime Convention in the Council of Europe, and what we are now developing on artificial intelligence. And when we see what we're developing on artificial intelligence, it becomes even more important to make sure that a number of the issues that we've been speaking about, like transparency, privacy by design, human rights by design, actually, are embedded in the technological development. I was talking to a group of startups in Norway 2 weeks ago, where everyone tries to invent the wheel with artificial intelligence because it's the thing to do. It is the technology that will lead us forward, but without necessarily having a reflection on what are the preconditions that would need to be followed. I can develop a tool which is going to enhance judiciary proceedings through artificial intelligence, but what do we want those tools to respond to in terms of neutrality, non-discrimination, transparency, explainability, responsibility? All of those issues need to be embedded from the start. And then we can say, well, these exceptional circumstances that we have lived through and that we will live through, we need to draw a number of conclusions from it, and we need to also ensure that we draw positive experiences from it.
Okay. Turning to Malavika.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. I wanted to sort of walk a little back and remind us that in a lot of South Asia in particular, we have sort of post-colonial emergency infrastructures that have been in place and that have been used over and over again. So there is a machinery that exists, which makes it very easy for strong-arm, dictators or, political elites to capture these institutions in times of emergency. But I also, on a more positive note, wanted to point out that because of this existing colonial machinery and apparatus, you see a lot of these countries have created their own post-colonial constitutional bills of rights. You have very interventionist judiciaries, some of the most interventionist Supreme Courts in the world, who actually step in to fill legislative and governance gaps to bring rights back into the picture. And I think that's a very encouraging thing, because the more extreme the emergency, the more of a trigger it is for very, very activist judiciaries to do something. And Christina was also talking about the sort of digital transformation-related changes that will stay, and Patrick did as well. Most of these countries don't even have a basic data protection law. So I think if you're suddenly and very rapidly transforming people from the offline and the excluded and the unincluded in welfare programs, financial systems, and because of lockdowns and social distancing, you've suddenly radically transformed their experience of being online and forced them to not use privacy-preserving means like cash, right? Everybody needs a credit card, needs to be online in some way. It's also a really good trigger for saying, look, you didn't do it all these years. Maybe now is a really good time, as you have more and more internet penetration, more people online in meaningful ways who are prevented from accessing welfare and benefits. Now might be a really good time to actually pass that law that's been on your drafting table for the last 15 years. Just a thought. So I think that's a really positive thing. And I think the last thing I'll say is, back to the slightly negative one, is that you have electoral imperatives also, and countries that have responded very quickly to the pandemic, whether in good or bad ways, are seen as strong, are seen as active in a moment of governance inertia, right? Poor countries are used to their government doing absolutely nothing for them. In a pandemic, they suddenly see them rolling out apps, creating infrastructure, doing something, even if it's terrible things telling them to stay at home. Suddenly they hear from their government, and they don't mind that this is a moment when those governments are trying to fix them in a system, make them legible and visible to them. It still looks like something active, like they're getting value for their taxes and their money. And this creates a sort of very paradoxical culture of like executive impunity, where this sort of strongman syndrome that we see in Asia is mistaken for some kind of, value addition and activism. So that's something I feel when we're looking at lessons and best practices, to always keep in mind that it's a very, very, very delicate balancing act between using the pandemic as a trigger to creating positive infrastructure, whether it's technical or legal, but also to watch out for this sort of paradox where strong authority, strong actions are seen as positive in a very sort of uncritical way.
Got you. We have just about 10 minutes left. Raphael, if you would like to comment on this question, feel free, but afterwards I'm going to take one or two final questions and just have people rapid fire answer them.
Yeah, just going back to the previous question, not Bruno's one, but the previous one about the Data Protection Authority.
Sure.
I think there is something very interesting going on, and many political scientists are actually studying that, like Colin Bennett or even sociologists like David Leon, in which when you have the increasing role of data protection authorities, for instance, in the discussions about elections, so data-driven elections and targeting and profiling and so on, data protection authorities become more important. So they're not seen or perceived as just technical authorities, but there is an increasing political role on their activities. And there is some kind of institutional dilemma that we're living that might be very interesting for political scientists in the coming years, which is, as you have, for instance, as Patrick said, if you have a discussion about legitimate uses of data in exceptional circumstances and a profound dialogue between the data protection authority and the government in terms of explaining what would be the legitimate uses and actions and policies and so on, you have an increasing role of the data protection authority regarding the actions of the executive. So it becomes more interesting for the executive to nominate someone in the future that might be better aligned with them. This is a discussion we're having in Brazil. When the Data Protection Authority was set up, actually the government was not so much aware about what was the Data Protection Authority about. But now they're becoming more aware that it's increasingly important, and it will shape it will constrain what they can do, so to speak. So there's this anxiety that in the next year, Bolsonaro might nominate someone politically aligned and not depend so much on technical and public servants and academics and so on. Mm-hmm. So you know what I see? What I mean? It's this kind of institutional dilemma regarding how the independence and the technical capacities of data protection authorities can be maintained in a time in which they're becoming increasingly politicized, so to speak, and increasing the incentives for the executive power to somehow shape their activities.
That makes sense. To make sure that everyone gets a chance to participate if they can, I saw a couple hands earlier. If anyone still has questions, we can take two and have the panel take it. So one in the back right there, and then one right here up in the middle.
Noor Nilajan, University of London. Thanks so much to the panel for a really fascinating and insightful discussion. And I'm wide awake, so it's day 3, so well done. It's a huge achievement. I just wanted to pick up on a point that Kristin made actually already, and she was talking about the infrastructures that are going to be needed for the next emergency that we go through. And this relates to the contact tracing developments that were happening in countries across the world. And speaking to the title of the panel, Limits of Emergency Powers, well, one of the limits that was put on those emergency powers was by certain big tech platforms which insisted on one particular architecture being adopted over another. Now, in this case, it turned out it was actually one that you could argue is representing data protection by design and by default, but it very starkly reminded, I think, everyone the kind of influence that those companies have. Mm-hmm. And not to put you on the spot, Kristin, but you did mention at the end that that's something we want to avoid the next time round. And I would just really welcome your views as to how that might happen. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Let's do that. And then while Christina responds or forms a response, if we can run up and get this second question as well. And then once the question's asked, I'll turn to the panel and you can feel free to answer either one.
I just wanted to quickly go back on the idea of building trust. I know, Malavika, you mentioned the idea of, how it actually happened that apps were shut down. I was just remembering in the case in France where when the tracking apps came out, they tried to actually give information about technically the things they're actually doing to protect privacy. And unfortunately, it kind of backfired because people just don't have that technical level. So they weren't able to even understand those measures and couldn't truly believe it. So that was one of the ways that they tried to increase the trust, and it didn't really work. It seems like the idea of shutting out the apps probably in the future will actually create some trust. So I'm just curious of any other example that any of you have seen that could actually help tangibly build trust and that have functioned or could function.
All right. Perfect. Feel free to take either question. Also, it's 5 minutes.
I just go quickly back to your very good question about our reliance and under which terms we go to bed with technology companies, let's say. First of all, to put the record straight, in fact, there has been a group of academics, and I was not involved. I don't want to have now false, decorate myself with false feathers, but that was a group of academics, among which Michael Weir, who is also at the conference, but many others, a large group, Seda Görses, many more names. They have developed an open source, and they call it DP3T protocol for a decentralized privacy preserving contact tracing, which was then used by Google and Apple, because they are controlling the mobile phone operating systems, to build this so-called exposure notification framework, which is the protocol that then in the next step has been used to build the app in most of the member states and also outside of Europe. It's the most commonly used framework for these contact tracing app. So in a way, the direction goes is good, because the proposal, like the basic architecture, was the group of academics who know more about coding than I do, I guess. Then that was implemented into this large operating system. That was a good thing, and we have to also say that this was actually a very welcome bridge to make this thing work. But what we shouldn't want is in the future that we are replacing what used to be, what I said earlier, public infrastructures, like the university teaching room, the schools, the courtroom, also what are the utilities and amenities of a city. This should not all become privatized just because we are undergoing digital transformation. And there we have to pay attention, because our public square is getting smaller and smaller if we let that happen.
Mm-hmm. And then Malvika, quickly.
Yeah, I think very briefly, it sounds a little...
You still have 3 minutes, you're all right.
Okay. A little repetitive to bring up open source and open data, but I think to the extent that apps and protocols and applications can really be open source and auditable, I think that helps to build trust. Even if it's not individual end users having the technical ability, which is what you were concerned about, I think if at least there are intermediaries and experts who can actually interrogate these apps and say, here's what it's doing, here's what it says it's doing, I think that builds a culture of trust within the technical community. I know in Singapore when they created Trace Together and these contact tracing apps, immediately a bunch of people turned around and said, why is it gathering all the data in a centralized manner? Can it not just stay on your phone and only be, beaming up Scotty only when someone's actually contracted COVID? And they actually took that on board and they said, yeah, actually we'll change it. So I think that kind of public dialogue is really useful. Mm-hmm. And I think trust is also not just in the app or the technology, but in the government. There was a lot of stickiness of measures because people trust the Singapore government. It has ridiculously insane to me. Like, I've never been in a country where people trust the government so much. It seems really weird to me. But then take a place like Hong Kong, where they have such a serious mistrust of government that they wouldn't get vaccinated because they think there's something wrong with the vaccine and it's all meant as some kind of weird social engineering project. So even elderly people who desperately need it because they're compromised and have comorbidities refuse to get vaccinated because it was the Hong Kong government using a Chinese vaccine that they thought, no, thank you, I'd rather just die. In the natural course of things, I don't have a lot of time left, but I'm not taking that chance. So I think it's trust at a systemic level, and not just a technical level, but I think those are all really important measures to keep in mind.
All right, in this final minute, any final statements that we'd like to say before we leave and let the next panel take over? All right, I want to let you all out with a couple seconds extra. And I want to first thank everyone on this panel. Thank you so much for joining and lending your expertise to this. Several people traveled from quite a distance and have been traveling for a while. I really appreciate it. And Rafael joining us from Brazil. So thank you all for attending, especially towards the end of the day. And hopefully there's a little more coffee just so we can make it through all the rest. Thank you all.
Thank you.